So, hi guys. Today, what I'm looking to do in this stream on the 5th of April 2022 is go over essentially what we can expect to see in the Donbass. Since my last proper in-depth stream, a lot has changed across Ukraine. I'm not going to be addressing certain alleged events in the Irpin and the Bucha area. I'm just going to try and keep it more to the military aspects and what we could be seeing in the coming weeks, in months, and how it might affect the rest of the war. So, since I last really did a proper stream like this, the Russians have effectively vacated the entire north of Ukraine. So, all Russian forces in the Kiev, the Chernigov, and the Sumy Oblasts areas, from my understanding, is they have completely pulled back to Belarus, or they've pulled back to the Russian border itself, and they are now most of those units, from what I could tell, they are resting, they're refitting, they are reinforcing, and they are refitting. I think I said refitting twice. Essentially, all the troops that were engaged in Kiev, Chernigov, and Sumy, they've pulled out for rest. They're having their strength built back up. They're getting new men. They're getting new equipment, and they are being strategically redeployed down to the Donbass front because this is where the war is situated at this stage. I'm not too sure if I will go in depth into what I make of the pullout of the north of Ukraine, but certainly the war is now centered to the east and the south of Ukraine, which is very interesting. Maybe that's the way the Russians should have started the entire war with, but either way, that's the way the Russians are now fighting this war. So for everyone, just for everyone to understand this, is there are now Ukrainian troops on the Ukrainian-Russian border. That's not because the Ukrainians pushed them out. That's because the Russians withdrew. So it'll be interesting to see if the Russians have any kind of security arrangements along this border. I wouldn't expect the Ukrainians to try and launch an offensive into Russia proper, but if there was certain small units of Ukrainian troops that might decide, okay, they've invaded Ukraine, we might as well start launching border raids across the border. That's something that could happen. It would be interesting to see how that happens. But for all intents and purposes, the major conventional fighting that we have seen is now going to be relegated to this area here. This is the Donbass. So I have to try and check myself because I am aware that not many people are invested in this stuff as much as me. So for people who aren't aware, just a quick background on this area. In 2014, there was the Euromaidan, the revolution, the coup, however you want to see it, that happened in Kiev. It overthrew Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian president at the time. He fled to Russia, left the Ukrainian state effectively headless. In the immediate aftermath of the Euromaidan in 2014, the Russians launched a spectacular takeover of Crimea, a massive helicopter, I wouldn't say assault because there was no actual fighting, but the Russians very effectively and mostly, completely bloodlessly secured Crimea, paralyzed any Ukrainian military on the peninsula, and neutralized them, disarmed them, just completely took the peninsula, just flawless textbook operation. In the east, to the east of the Dnieper, in the south in Odessa, I believe in Kherson as well, but especially in the east, Kharkov, Luhansk, Donetsk. These are areas that historically are very pro-Russian. They have majority Russian speakers. They have fairly substantial ethnically Russian populations. Politically, these are the people who would have voted for in pre 2014 the Party of Regions, which was the Russophile party. That's where we were in 2014. So around about the same time as Crimea, there was a lot of protests across the east and the south of Ukraine. So Euromaidan was obviously a pro-Western movement that very much angered and polarized the country to a large degree. That in the east and in the south, the pro-Russian, the Russophile population, they saw that they essentially the government that they elected had been unfairly overthrown, be it through a Western coup, be it through essentially a bandit-led rebellion that overthrew the legitimate government. However you want to perceive it, that's the way a lot of Russians took it, or Russophiles in Ukraine took it. So what you've seen in Kharkov, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Odessa was local Russian protest movements rose up. They were demanding either the resumption of Viktor Yanukovych or a legitimate government, because they didn't see the revolutionary government that was installed after the Euromaidan is initially legitimate. So that's how the anti-Euromaidan protests started. They very rapidly moved into the state that, okay, the revolution in Kiev, it's being run by radical ultra-Ukrainian nationalists. These are people who are very anti-Russian. They don't like the Russian language. They hate Soviet heritage. We consider ourselves, we were part of the USSR. Our grandfather fought against the fascists, against the Nazis. Uh, and now we have effectively fascists and Nazis have taken over the Ukrainian government. We don't have a future in Ukraine, so we might as well try and rejoin Russia. That is our historical homeland. We might as well try and return to that. So in Odessa, in Kharkov, there was attempts to take over, and I don't think it happened necessarily in Odessa, but it did happen in Kharkov very briefly. It definitely happened in Donetsk and Lugansk. Is pro-Russian protesters physically forced their way into local administration buildings, into local government buildings, took over the local police department, attempted in Kharkov and in Odessa very briefly to set up sort of breakaway regions of Ukraine, quasi-independent states. In Odessa, the situation was quite mollified whenever there was quite... I don't want to get too in-depth in this. This is just a quick run over for people who might not be aware of why the Donbass is so important, but in Odessa, the anti-Euromaidan movement was quite brutally crushed whenever... So essentially, pro-Russian protesters, they took over a local trade congress hall in Odessa, and then radical Ukrainian nationalists came and without going into specific details, they threw Molotov cocktails into the building. The building was set on fire. 43 to 48 43 or 48, I can't remember the specific figure, but around about 40 to 50 people were burned to death quite horrifically in the Trade Congress Hall in Odessa. That completely just demoralized the pro-Russian movement in Odessa. It's left a long shadow across the city to this day. You can bet that there is still a lot of pro-Russian people in Odessa, but they're very quiet, because the Trade Congress massacre in 2014 casts a long shadow across the city. And since then, there has been a lot of some of the more radical Ukrainian nationalist movements have based themselves in Odessa to kind of, I don't know how you'd want to word it, suppress, oppress, mollify, however you want to word it, the pro-Russian sentiment that is in the city. In Kharkov, Kharkov itself didn't exactly break away from Ukraine, but the local administration building in 2014 was stormed. There was a brief attempt to establish a Kharkov People's Republic, separate away from the Ukrainian state, but the Ukrainian state was able to mobilize forces fast enough to effectively regain control and reestablish its order across the city. So they're the two big examples that failed. So what I'm trying to paint here before I specifically go into the Donbass republics is, in the immediate aftermath of 2014 revolution, the Ukrainian state to the east and the south of the Dnieper. So from, like I say, I wish I had a way to draw on this map, but from this sort of arc from here all the way up to Kharkov, the Ukrainian state effectively looked like it was in the process of disintegration. It was very doubtful. I can remember watching it day in and day out at the time. It was very doubtful if the Ukrainian state would still exist in those areas, or if Ukraine would just completely slide into civil war. So with that kind of attitude, with that kind of atmosphere, to give you a bit of an outline on this area, in two places where the counter revolution or the revolution, however you want to say it, the succeed. I know some people get upset with how I pronounce that, but the successionist republics where it for me did succeed is in Donetsk and Lugansk. So in both cities, these are very pro-Russian, very massive. I think there might be a nominal ethnic Russian majority, but there's certainly a lot of the ethnic Ukrainians would consider themselves pro-Russian. Guys, you have to understand it. With I'm a bit conscious that I don't want to veer completely off kilt here, but the second, if I'm not mistaken, the second largest minority in Russia are Ukrainians. So in this area, the Donbas area, there are a lot of Ukrainians. So there's kind of been, since 2014, there's been a polarization within the quote unquote Ukrainian nation, that is the Ukrainian ethnic nation itself. It is, I would say, it would be safe to say that most Ukrainians are anti-Russian, and they've had moved in that direction since 2014, and especially since the invasion. But there is certainly a significant proportion of ethnic Ukrainians who live in Russia, live within these sort of borderline areas of Russia, that would be more pro-Russian than they would be Ukrainian, because they would view Ukrainian identity as being taken over, being warped and dominated by quote unquote fascists, banderists that come from mostly Western Ukraine, and that is an identity, well, a Ukrainian identity that Eastern and Southern Ukrainians might not necessarily subscribe to. So, with that sort of quick ethnographic out of the way, so in Lugansk and Donetsk, they did the succession attempts did succeed. There was two republics established. I'm sure most people are sort of aware of that basic fact. The Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. There was two quasi-referendums, whether you consider them legitimate or not. Those were held. Massive majorities in those referendums for succession in the areas controlled by the secessionists. So Lugansk is, I would say Lugansk is probably the lesser of the two sister republics, because everyone knows about Donetsk. Everyone, I guess it's just because of the sort of the, I don't want to say prestige, but whenever people think of the Donbass War in 2014, they all think of people like Motorola, of Givi, of Strelkov, the Battle of Donetsk Airport, the Cyborgs, the Battle of Debaltseve, and most of that was done by the Donetsk militia and fighters. So Donetsk kind of has this mystique around it, so it gets a lot more attention and publicity than its sister republic in Lugansk. So and also it isn't strategically insignificant, but I think the Donetsk Republic has a more strategic position than Lugansk, and I'll sort of go over a quick overlay why. So in 2014, whenever the republics and the succession started to begin, Mariupol briefly fell for around a month into the hands of secessionist rebels. So, sort of give you, this will expand why Mariupol is so crucial, or why the Russians in the DNR is actively trying to take the city instead of just wearing it down. Mariupol is considered like the city, the lost city. This was the city that we held, but then the Ukrainian fascists, the banderists, they stole it from us, and since then they've oppressed our brothers and sisters, our ethnic kin in Mariupol. That's sort of how it's perceived there. So for around about a month, Mariupol did fall out of Ukrainian government control. It did sort of begin to merge into the wider Donetsk People's Republic, but the Ukrainian army was able to storm the city and establish Ukrainian government control. And since then, I believe it is around here is where the nominal front line was. So that's why Mariupol is so holds such appeal to the fighters of the DNR, and to a degree, the Russians kind of buy into this. The lost city, the city we had, the city we lost. If we can just reclaim it, then we will achieve what we failed to achieve in 2014. It really has this mystical sort of appeal to it. Also, the Azov battalion made a big showing that whenever they started to arrive and set up shop in the Donbass, they set up their main headquarters in Mariupol. To feed into some of the footage that's come out of Mariupol from refugees that have predominantly gone to Russia or gone into the Russian side. A lot of them have said that in recent months, especially since the war, but even going back years, and these have been allegations that have been going on for a while, that Azov battalion militants in Mariupol would oppress, would harass ethnic Russians, people who would consider themselves Russian in the city. So the DNR also feels it's like we have to take Mariupol to destroy the Azov battalion, to destroy the Nazis, to destroy the Banderists, and also to liberate our brothers and sisters who've been oppressed by these people. So that's quickly couch Mariupol. Then the front line sort of ran up here, ran very close around Donetsk. So there was very significant. It was kind of the hallmark of the 2014 was the fighting around Donetsk airport. I believe, yeah, actually, yeah. So here you can clearly see this is battle damage from the fighting in 2014. The airport was quite brutally destroyed, and it kind of became legendary in its own way in certain circles, and certainly in some of the areas I sort of frequented on the internet. It just the battles around the airport sort of became a quasi legendary thing in of itself, and especially for the Donetsk. So the front line sort of ran around here for the past 8 years. So this is why the airport is still in the ruined state it is, because I believe just somewhere, just basically on the other side of the airport, probably still is. I don't know if they've been pushed back, but the Ukrainian army is somewhere in this area. So that is why the airport has been left in ruins, because it is still before the invasion, it still was kind of an active war zone. So that's kind of how close it was to Donetsk. Without going into too much specifics of the war in 2014, essentially the Ukrainian army came in, largely took back Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. This was an area that fell into separatist hands. Looked like they were going to completely potentially reestablish Ukrainian government control over the entirety of the Donbas, but then the Russians intervened in a massive way. The Ukrainians suffered quite a spectacular and bruising defeat around the town of Debaltseve. The Ukrainians retreated. The war sort of stabilized, and for the past 8 years, the war has mostly been largely artillery duels um, between both sides. So that's kind of a quick overlay of the Donbass. Kind of give another quick aspect of it. This is the main coal producing region of Ukraine. Just to give you where is yes, here we go. So these mountains here, this is why it's also quite strategic for Ukraine. Or not. Oh, just let me in one of these roads. Yes, here we go. Just can we see it from here? Oh, I'm no. I've just realized I didn't share screen. Bugger. Um Thank you for the guy who just pointed that out to me. I feel like an idiot. I've just spent no. Well, thankfully we didn't really need the map for most of what I've just said. The most of where I've just been talking about is this area here. I apologize, chat. Thank you very much to the person who just messaged me. That was very poor on my part. Completely slipped my mind. So thankfully, the majority of what I was just talking about did not require a map. But just to give you an idea, so just for what I guess the most thing was, this is Donetsk Airport. Just so you can have a look, you can see just on what I was just saying, you can see the battle damage that's still extant on the airport that was done in 2014. Just a general outline. There's Mariupol. There's Donetsk. The front line for around 8 years was somewhere around here. So as I was saying, this is why the airport was never repaired. And I guess the rest of what I was talking did not need the map to show. So I apologize. Very poor on my part. I should have checked up. Thank you very much to the person who pointed that out to me. But thankfully, most of what I was yammering on about did not require the map. But now we will get into map stuff. So as I was saying, in terms of economics, the Donbass is the major. It's kind of like one of the biggest was one of the biggest industrial parts of Ukraine. That is why you have the example of the Avostal metallurgical plant here. Then there is another large industrial area up here, and in Donetsk, I believe, was a very large industrial city. Where is the industrial parts of the city? Well, okay, I think that's more of a mine. But all you need to know is this is kind of where Ukrainian heavy industry was largely based, and it is also it was the biggest coal producing region for Ukraine. So just to give you an outline of this, where was I? That's on top of one of these. Okay, yeah, I guess this kind of illustrates it. So, um, is this actually one of it itself? No, it's not, but that is over there. So, in terms of geography, this area of Ukraine is largely flat. So out there, that is kind of what we're talking about. It is flat steppe, and it's usually steppe from here all the way until you basically approach the Moldovan and Romanian borders. This is steppe country. So what is this hill? What are these hills? This is slag. This is all coal, debris from coal mines, from slag deposits. So if you've looked at any, so yep, here, this is a slag deposit. These kind of dot the terrain in and around this area. So the high ground in this part of Ukraine. So this is a good example here. You can actually see the conveyor belt that comes out from one of the mines that just deposits the slag. So this is a major coal producing region of Ukraine, or was. So whenever this area left Ukraine, or the coal mines couldn't run because of the active combat that was held here for 8 years, Ukraine actually went from a coal exporter into a coal importer. So that's one of the economic aspects of it. And to such an extent, I believe that several battalions of the Lugansk and Donetsk armies are known as miners' battalions because they were completely staffed by people who came out the mines to take up arms in the war. So that's to give you just a quick outline. And as you can see, this part of Ukraine juts well into Russia. This is kind of like a not a peninsula, but it's to a degree it juts quite significantly into Russia. This adds into why Russia did not want Ukraine to join NATO, because if Ukraine had joined NATO, this is a NATO border that projects right into Russia, right into the southern Russian plain. Without going too deep into it, in World War II, the Germans, whoever holds military initiative, whoever holds air superiority, they dominate this area. So the Germans rapidly dominated this area in 1942 up until the Battle of Stalingrad. Then, whenever the tables flipped, the Soviets uh, rapidly pushed the Germans back. So essentially, this kind of terrain here in semi-modern to modern warfare, it flips rapidly depending on who holds the initiative. So this is why it's a very hot key area for Russia. So now, if we bring it back to what is happening today, and what you all you good people are here to listen about, is this is where the war is most likely going to be definitively won. And I know I have given certain pronouncements before, which turned out to be incorrect, so I should always be conscious against doing them again. But pardon me. I believe this is where the Russians, if they are going to win this war in a significant way, this is one of the biggest stepping stones to do it. So the Russian initial invasion failed. Depending on your point of view, I would say it failed. I wouldn't say it was beaten back, but it certainly failed in its objectives. This is the next big plank, and in many ways, I think this is probably the bigger plank. So I think taking the Donbass and destroying the Ukrainian army here might actually hold more significance than, say, if the Russians did in some way manage to take Kiev in a month long over the past month or so, just in terms of the men and material in this area. So as I was yammering and jabbering on about, there has been a war here on and off for 8 years. So in this area, this sort of oblong area here, the Ukrainian army has been building up its strength. It is dug in, it has troops, and it has kept and built up troops here for 8 years. This is why the Russians are looking to pull off their biggest maneuver here. Because if the Russians are able to encircle and destroy this Ukrainian army here, it will be a significant blow to Ukraine. You're talking probably most of its tanks, the tanks that it still has, probably most of its effective elite combat tested troops. The manpower that would probably be lost. It will be a very significant blow for Ukraine. I'll never say never, especially considering Ukraine is basically now being hooked up to NATO arms and re-equipment. But it will be hard for me to see how, if this army group here is destroyed, how that doesn't blow open the entire east of Ukraine for Russia to more effectively move in it in and take over the territory, if that is what it's minded to do. So for people who aren't aware, although I'm sure you are if you're listening to listen, if you've been in the channel, the Battle of Mariupol is winding down. There was a large, I believe the Marines were deployed in this area. If not, I think they might have been down here. But effectively, an entire company of Ukrainian Marines laid down their arms. It appears to be after their commander was killed in recent days. So I believe around about 260 Ukrainian Marines. Ukrainian Marines are elite. They're very competent troops. They're very professional. They've equipped themselves well. They've dealt. They've made the Russians and the Donetsk militias pay in blood for the progress they've done in Mariupol. So if they're starting to tap out and surrender now, that's quite significant. There is also another surrender, I believe around about 60 Ukrainian troops surrendered today as well. That sort of illustrates to me that we are entering the final hours of the Battle of Mariupol. If the Ukrainian troops are starting to surrender themselves. So I believe that there is a lingering pocket in this part of the city to the north of Avostol, and also there is a sliver along the port, along the coast here, that is still in Ukrainian hands. And I read some reports that suggested that Ukrainian troops are trying to destroy as much of the port as they can before the Russians take it from them. And I believe that some remnants of the Azov battalion are still fighting on in the Avostol metallurgical plant. So Mariupol it's a done deal. It has been for weeks. It took longer than I expected, but essentially what Ukrainian troops there are doomed. They're either going to be killed or they will be forced to surrender. So in the next few days, next week, we will probably see the final end of the Battle of Mariupol, to such an extent that the Russians themselves are aware of it. I've seen videos and evidence that the Russians are starting to pull troops out of Mariupol. I think they're letting the Chechens, the Russian Marines, and the Donetsk militia finish off the battle. And the Russians are pulling out most of their troops and starting to redeploy them north. Because north of Volonovka is another place where there was a very grueling battle between the DNR, some elements of the Russian army, but the Ukrainians. The entire town was effectively it's a complete ruin at this stage. But for about a month, there was heavy fighting in this area, but the Ukrainians were, from what I've seen, is that the Ukrainians were quite heavily defeated in this area. They lost a lot of men, they lost a lot of equipment, and they were pushed far back. I believe somewhere up around about this here area, and effectively once Volonovka fell to Russian aligned forces, that sealed the deal for Mariupol. There was never going to be a realistic attempt, a breakthrough or a breakout from Mariupol for the Ukrainians in the city. So Russian forces from Mariupol, Russian forces from Russia proper, be they redeployed from elsewhere in Ukraine or fresh units, because I've seen evidence. There's been footage that's come out from Ekaterinburg, which is here, which is the far side of the Urals. Others in Saratov, there's been footage coming out of Russian trains carrying a lot of tanks. Some of them look to be fairly modern tanks. I've seen some purported train footage that appear to have some of the more modern T90s, which would explain why I haven't seen those in fighting yet. So they look to be being deployed to Ukraine. So this to me tells me that now Russia is bringing in troops from the Far Eastern and the Central Military District. So it is. The Ukrainians have been able to, certainly in terms of equipment, destroy quite a lot of Russian tanks and vehicles, but it must be a bit demoralizing for Ukraine whenever it then looks that Russia is now just pulling in potentially thousands more of those very same tanks from the Far East and from Siberia. So and especially fresh troops. So it's the Russians are certainly ramping up their war effort, and they are. I think the Russians are aware that this is going to be, as I've said for about the last couple of weeks, around about a 6 to 9 month war. So we have fresh troops coming in from Siberia in the Far East. They're starting to be deployed into the Donbass. We have troops coming down from Belarus out of the Gomel area. These are the troops that pulled out of Kiev, of Chernigov, from Sumy. They're all starting to work their way around to the Donbass. The Russians are building up their forces, and I believe they're building up their forces in two key areas: to the south, round about the Volonovka area, and also up here in Izyum. Because what I would expect and what the Russians to do is, and it looks like they are doing it, is to enact a pincer maneuver to push up in this sort of direction, so south. So Russian troops have reached this town here, Baranovkoy, if I've pronounced that correctly. Russian troops have reached there, so they've broken out of Izyum. They're starting to push to the south. I haven't seen the Russians begin their attack from the south, but I would expect the Russians here to push up maybe in here and for some kind of link up to be somewhere around this area, and just to encircle the entire Ukrainian army in this area. I do not expect the Russians are going to physically go into Slovyansk and Kramatorsk in any time soon. I think they're just going to encircle this area, destroy the Ukrainian army in the field. Because the other aspect, this territory is where the Russian army would, if the Russian army is going to do well, it is this terrain that it is going to do well in. So let's just see if this helps us. Oh, there is not. Come on. Let's have a look here, just to give you an idea of this. No. Why is that showing up that I can? Big tech. Come on. Give us a road. Give us a road. Okay, it's not working. I'll see if I can find somewhere else. But this is a good example. Some guy's hand. We have a view of a field. Okay, not the best, but as you can see, this terrain is flat. It is small villages, and that hand is really sort of creeping me out. It's floating dismembered hand, but as you can sort of see just behind this brush, it's fields. So you're talking flat land, long farmers' fields with some brush trees along the fields, stuff like that. This is terrain. This is tank country. This is where tanks work their best if they're employed properly. Where tanks don't work their best is in close-knit combat, in cities, in sort of areas like this, where someone with an anti-tank weapon could be hiding around any corner, any street, can easily hit a vehicle in its rear. That's not where tanks work their best. This flat land around these towns and cities, like I say, tank country. And the Russians, yeah, they probably now can effectively employ air superiority in this area. To a certain degree anyway. So this is where the Russian army, if it is going to do well, this is where it will do well. If it doesn't, then it's very bad for Russia. But as I say, the Russians are mostly mechanized. If you've noticed, pretty much any engagement that happens with Russians anywhere in Ukraine, there are tanks involved, there's BTRs involved. It's a mobile force, it's a mechanized, it's an armored force. So it can move across country quickly, rapidly, deploy heavy firepower on targets if needed. So this is what I'm expecting the Russians are going to employ their strengths on in this open country here to take this area. Once they secure the encirclement, they'll then turn back. I would expect clear out a lot of this pocket, force the remaining Ukrainian troops into maybe some of these larger towns, such as Pokrovsk, pardon me, into Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and maybe they'll leave it to the Lugansk, Donetsk, and the Chechens to deal with, but I wouldn't expect the Russians will physically actually go into these cities after the Ukrainians. I think it would probably make more sense to just besiege the cities and just starve the Ukrainians out. That, to me, would make the best sense. Let your rear echelon or auxiliary troops, like I say, the Donbass republics or the Chechens, keep the Ukrainians bottled up. So that would, one, destroy most Ukrainian heavy equipment So most of their tanks, most of their mobile artillery, most of their large artillery guns, they would all be destroyed in the field here, destroyed or captured, or they would end up encircled and bottled up in these towns and these cities if that's the way the Russians want to go. So why is this important? This opens up the east of Ukraine. So I'm sure people are aware whenever Russia invaded, it really did not go well in the Sumy and the Chernigov area. Russia became very bogged down in these cities, failed to take these cities. It became long, drawn out, very bitter, very costly for the Russians in terms of equipment and most likely manpower as well, because they couldn't properly affect and negate the ability for the Ukrainians to bring in supplies from the West. But if the Russians can completely destroy the Ukrainians here or take them out of play, this opens up significant roads for the Russians to move forward. So the Russians can then move up. They can encircle Zaporozhye from the west, circle Dnipro from the west, prevent any attempts for the Ukrainians to try and get across the Dnieper River, but also, more crucially, Kharkov. So the Russians pulled out from besieging these cities, but they haven't pulled out of Kharkov. And why is that? Because I think that I might save it for whenever I come on to the bit about Kherson, but I think the Russians have some longer term ambitions for Kharkov. But either way, as I've said in previous streams, this Russian battle group that invaded into Kharkov is the worst of the Russian units that have been involved in the war so far. And I've given various reasons. I'll not go over them, but what the troops that went into this area, what they have actually achieved is pretty poor, very poor indeed. So I expected the Russians to make up for that once they take over this area, once they take the Ukrainian army out of play, is they will begin to advance and hollow out Ukraine east of the Dnieper. And why is this important for Kharkov? This means that the Russians can now approach Kharkov from the south and properly encircle the city. And as you can see, and as I've said in previous streams, and I'll quickly overrun it for people who aren't aware, the biggest thing why these cities are so important, why Kharkov is so important, look at the roads. It is also mud season at the moment in Ukraine. Spring rains have arrived. The ground is sodden. It is mud. It is wet. Vehicles, tanks, they get stuck. It's not good territory to advance in. So it'll be interesting to see how the Russians attempt to deal with that in this encirclement. But if you're looking to move fast in Ukraine, you need to do it on a paved road. And as you can see around Kharkov, it is a major nexus point for transport and logistics. So going up into Russia, I'll not go into the specifics of these particular notes because I did extensively in the previous stream. But if you're going to bring in supplies from Russia into deeper into Ukraine, if you don't have Kharkov, if Kharkov isn't under your control, you need to find alternate routes. You need to take all these side roads. You need to go off around the beaten path. Because the Russians haven't been able to properly establish control over these areas, a lot of these convoys have been ambushed. This is where the Ukrainians have been able to equip themselves quite well, is these infantry-based, light, mobile, hard-hitting ambushes on Russian logistics and supply convoys and soft-skinned vehicles. And it happens in territories like this, on these small side roads off the beaten path, where the Russians are forced to send their logistics because they as you can see, if Russia doesn't hold Kharkov, it doesn't control this ring road, so it can't send the supplies along these ring roads and deeper into Ukraine. So if the Russians are able to push up from the south, envelop Kharkov, doesn't even need to take the city, just push the Ukrainians into the city so that the Russians can exercise competent control over the ring road. That opens up a lot of roads. That's probably not the best pun, or it opens up a lot of options for the Russians. It soothes a lot of their logistics problems and supply problems that they've been plagued with in their operations in Ukraine, and especially in eastern Ukraine. So now if we see so yeah, just to illustrate again, this you should probably view as phase one of the new Russian strategy, the battle in the Donbass. Phase two would probably be the push up to Poltava and the encirclement of Kharkov. Depending how that goes, phase three, they could push up further into this area of Ukraine where Russian troops were, but they pulled out for various reasons, and they could try and take and hollow out Ukraine from east of the Dnieper. That could be what the Russians are anticipating. Once we achieve that, the Ukrainians will be forced to accede to our demands in negotiations. Failing that, or another alternative to that, because I don't see any scenario where the Russians don't try and envelop Kharkov. I just after Donbass, it's just logical. I don't see how the Russians can still be enveloping Kharkov and not push up from that area. But let's say if the Russians decide, okay, we've enveloped Kharkov, we might go as far as Poltava, but we're not going further north into Ukraine. What could be the next scenario for the Russians to do? So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 could be the Russians try and make another play on Nikolaev, try and break through into Odessa. That could be another scenario in which the Russians are anticipating to go for. So there's two main routes that the Russians could be looking at that could win them this war on the terms that they are looking to achieve. I will probably develop those points in its own dedicated stream at a future point. We kind of want to keep this more dedicated onto the fighting in the Donbass, but just to sort of give you an idea of why this battle in the Donbass could be so important. The removal of Ukrainian men and equipment, the opening up of a land bridge for logistics into southern Ukraine, the ability to envelop Kharkov and open up logistics from Belgorod and from Russia proper into this part of Ukraine, opening up all the roads that go through the Donbass. Also, it allows the two Donbass republics to achieve their territorial claims, the fullest extent that they have claimed of their oblast. So, as you can see, hopefully the footage is good enough on the recording and for the stream, but you can sort of see this dotted line is the internal oblast borders of the internal borders of Ukraine. This is Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. This is what they claim is part of their country, their little state. So if they can reach that territorial extent, these two republics will have a large ceremonial victory. It'll give a large moral victory for Russia at home. The Russian army and Putin in the Kremlin can then arguably quite legitimately portray this as quite a significant victory for Russia in this conflict in Ukraine. It has liberated the Donbas. It has freed the Donbas people from the oppression and of the Ukrainian fascists. Yada yada yada. But also, as I'm saying, it's mostly just down to logistics. That's the main thing. So with the fighting in Mariupol, just to quickly touch on this, as you can see, the main roads that go from Russia into southern Ukraine go via Mariupol. So as long as Mariupol isn't properly controlled by Russian forces, the logistics train gets slowed down, has to divert, it slows everything down. Without going into the topic of a previous stream, if you want to see me properly in depth go into logistics, I recommend you go into my YouTube, look for the stream that has Berdyansk in its topic. I address in depth the logistics situation in the south of Ukraine involving Crimea, Mariupol, Berdyansk, and why it is so crucial in this area. Because essentially, if an army isn't fed, if it isn't properly supplied, if it isn't reinforced, it is not effective. So that's the way you have to sort of couch everything to do with this war. And what is key in this war are the roads, especially at this time of year, whenever the only real significant progress that armies can make is on paved roads that are not going to turn to mud. So now if we start to go into what is actually happening on the ground, we'll start up in this area. Severodonetsk is sort of the northern point of the northeastern point of this Ukrainian salient. This city has been enveloped from three sides, so from the south, from the east, and from the north by the Lugansk and by the Russians for, I believe it's around about a month now. The only connection Severodonetsk has back to Ukrainian territory, as you can see, are these bridges, which are then connected to Lysychansk. Why I guess this will apply to all these cities I'm talking about, but these cities, yes, they could very well be majority pro-Ukrainian, but there are pro-Donetsk, pro-Lugansk, pro-Russian populations in these cities. And in Lysychansk, in the past week, footage has emerged and the local Ukrainian administration has tried to start an investigation to find out who did it. But someone in this city went out and started planting mines on the main roads in the city because, as you can imagine, this is an active battle zone. There is not a lot of civilian traffic operating. It is mostly military traffic. It is mostly military traffic giving supply and reinforcements across these bridges into Severodonetsk. So if someone is planting mines on the main roads in this city, not the best, makes the Ukrainians in the city start to get really touchy. Can we trust the people in this city? Which then will lead me to incidents in Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. In these two cities, the local Ukrainian administration has, from my understanding, is they have effectively banned any of the local civilian population from going out after 6 o'clock, and no one is allowed out of their home with a phone to take photos or videos. If anyone is taking photos or videos in Kramatorsk or Slovyansk, they're immediately arrested as a potential Russian saboteur. Because the Ukrainians, especially in Slovyansk, and I'm pretty sure they're probably doing it in Kramatorsk at the moment, but they are heavily fortifying these cities. They understand what is coming down the road from Izyum, and probably in the future coming from the east whenever the Russian offensive really begins. These people are starting to fortify these cities as much as they can, but they are very, very concerned about the local civilian population in these cities because they don't trust them, and probably for good reason, because a lot of these are cities that did fall into separatist control back in 2014, and there has been incidences where small acts of pro-Russian vandalism have occurred in these cities since the war began. But also, for people who've been a bit of a more of a long time viewer of the Telegram will know there is a very specific Telegram account that I am pretty sure is run or is definitely, pardon me, or is definitely known. Oh, pardon me, dear. Or is definitely known to Russian military intelligence, and it is daily. It posts dozens and dozens of geolocated reports on the exact movements and numbers of Ukrainian troops all across Ukraine, but certainly in the past couple of weeks, especially in the Donbass area. And how is that happening? Well, I think it's down to two things. There are a lot of Russians currently out there trolling across Ukrainian social media. Anyone in Ukraine who posts a video, you can bet there'll probably be a Russian somewhere who will be very interested in looking at that. They're looking at foolish videos that Ukrainian civilians might take and absent-mindedly upload that might show locations or activities of Ukrainian army, or a bit more perniciously, for the Ukrainians at least, pro-Russian ethnic Russians, Ukrainians who lean Russian, they could very well be actively spotting and providing this information to Russian military intelligence, to pro-Russian Telegram channels. So that is how that specific Telegram account that I often post operates, and how I believe it operates. So you can be sure that there will be people in these cities that will, if they have the opportunity, will try and report on the locations and the activities of Ukrainian military assets in those cities. So that is why the local Ukrainian administration very, very particularly and pointedly said, you will not take, if anyone is outside of their home and they are taking a photo or a video, irregardless of the circumstances, you are liable to be arrested and detained as a potential Russian agent. So the Ukrainians are sitting on very touchy, unsecure ground here at this point. So where was I? In Severodonetsk. So yeah, this city is encircled on three sides. The Lysychansk is under pretty much constant artillery fire. Whereas Urobushny, I should really know geography of this area off the top of my hand. I did most of my dissertation was based on it. Here, okay. This city is currently in the process of actually being taken by the Russian army and Lugansk militias. So earlier today, there was reports. I believe it was somewhere. Is this the industrial area? I don't know if I could specifically locate exactly where it is, but this is the industrial area, so it was somewhere in this area. Um, So, from my understanding, is this northern part of the city is now in Russian Lugansk control. They're fighting through the city, pushing the Ukrainians ever steadily out to the south, so to force them back into Severodonetsk. But earlier today is that some kind of acid vat, some kind of chemical storage tank in this industrial part of the city was destroyed. There's a bit of dispute of how it happened. The Russians are saying the Ukrainians intentionally blew it up. The Ukrainians are saying the Russians intentionally blew it up. Some Russian Telegram accounts are saying this is a false flag chemical attack. This is a provocation. I'm a bit skeptical of those claims because, like I say, this is an active battlefield. There are tanks, there are men fighting and dying in these streets in this area. There's constant artillery. I think it's probably more likely that maybe a stray artillery shell, maybe a tank shell, whatever it was, be it from whatever side, probably hit the explosive vat and that blew it up. I believe I haven't heard that it's actually ended up killing anyone, but there was quite a large chemical cloud was released, and I believe the wind at the time it was drifting somewhere to the south, but I haven't heard any more on that. So for people who were aware of that earlier in the day and were posting to me about it, that's my understanding of the situation. Thankfully, it is not the chemical disaster that people were fearing. I haven't heard reports of people being injured or dying of it. Uh, so thankfully, the wind seems to have pushed it to the south, which to me, if it went into the civilian area, we probably would have heard about people being killed. But it seems to have potentially just harmlessly, thankfully, drifted off into this wooded area and dispersed over these fields. So that's the story there. What is this? This looks like some kind of military installation here. Just going by the revertments here. Is this some kind of industrial? No, it sort of looks like military. The way they've, you know what I mean? Like these are revertments that have been built up around it. So if there's explosions around these buildings, the blast is deflected by these sandbanks. Be sure what that could be. Saying that this industrial, no, this is industrial. So yeah, I don't know what that is, but yeah. So Rubizhny is as I said, the Russians in Lugansk are currently actively fighting through the north of the city and are in the process of taking it. And then the big story, I guess, of the Donbass so far is the events in Izyum. Izyum is, a lot of people in my chat will probably be aware. From my understanding, Izyum is Russian/Ukrainian. I believe it's the word for raisin, because anytime I translate anything that is about this place and post it in the group, people always laugh and sit there and say, "Oh, the Russians have captured raisins." So that's this area, but um, so over the past week, heavy fighting in this area. The Russians completely eventually ended up taking the town. The Ukrainians blew up both bridges, but the Russians somewhere along this river were able to effectively set up a large pontoon. The Russians have crossed the Severodonetsk in force in significant numbers. They're putting tanks, they're putting heavy equipment across it. They are pushing the Ukrainians ever steadily down this road towards Sloviansk. But more interestingly is, while there are Russians occupying the Ukrainians and pushing down here, is a large part of the Ukrainian offensive is taking this road off to the west. If I just orientate myself, yeah, they've taken the road off to the west and they are pushing down this road very hard, very fast towards Bravinkov. Bravinkov? How would I Barvinkov? That's how I'll pronounce that. I believe the Russians have reached the outskirts of this town, but this is the biggest problem that the Ukrainians currently have. The fact that the Russians have been fairly effective at getting this far down here. As you can see, this is pushing far to the east of Sloviansk. It is pushing deep into the rear of the Ukrainian positions in the Donbass. But crucially, as I say, the roads, it is all to do with the roads. So if the Russians take this town, as you can see, 2, 3, 4, 4 roads from the north and the west go into this town. This cuts off this road that brings supply, brings men, brings reinforcements to the Ukrainian army in the Donbass. So if the Russians take this, continue pushing down, they could take this road. That's another crucial supply line lost. And why is it crucial? If you know, like a road is a road. Surely there's other roads. Yes, there are other roads. But as I have said in previous streams, and I've tried to labor the point, roads in Ukraine, they're not big. So if you can, this isn't the best. I can't really do Google road on this, can I? But um, this isn't a big road. This is probably the best we're going to get. As you can see, this is a 2-lane road. So this isn't like a freeway. This isn't a motorway. This is a 2-lane road. And this is open country. This is where if there's going to be drones, if there's going to be air power, anything coming down this road can be seen from a long way away. And artillery, airstrikes, whatever can hit it. So, for example, just to sort of illustrate, let's say these roads taken. Let's say all the other roads are taken. The Ukrainians only have this road here to rely on. So that's a dam. It looks like not a bridge, but as you can see, this is a 2-lane road. So okay, 2-lane road. Okay, trucks drive up and down it. But what happens if there's an accident on this road? That's 1 lane of the road taken out of action. If there's something destroyed on this road, that's that lane taken out of action. Okay, well, surely trucks can just go skirt off the road and around the accident. Yes, but it is mud season in Ukraine, so maybe in summer you could do that. But if for example, this part of the road, a couple of tanks and trucks are destroyed, so vehicles then have to go off around the road into this mud. Yeah, they're only skirting off the road, but very quickly, especially if the ground is wet, this is going to turn into bog. It is going to track. It's going to trap trucks. It's going to trap tanks. Things will get stuck in that road. Stuff that's it'll start to back up everything all the way up along this road because all the tanks, all the troops, all the trucks trying to get down here obviously can't pass. They all get backed all the way up the road. A Russian drone comes along, spots this. A Russian aircraft comes along, spots this, reports it back. Long range Russian artillery comes in. Russian aircraft come in, start bombing everything on this road, and the Ukrainian just lose potentially hundreds of men, dozens of tanks, drastically needed equipment that they need that not only they can't use anymore because they're not getting there, but they've been destroyed. So that is why roads are so important and why taking out roads is so crucial for each side. In the summer months, whenever the ground dries up, roads become less of a crucial issue. But certainly at this time of year, in mud season, in the Raputsia, this is roads are crucial. Paved roads are crucial in this part of the world, in Ukraine. So just to go back to what's happening here. So as I'm saying, this is probably the biggest headache, biggest problem the Ukrainians have is this Russian breakout in this area here. And the fact that the Ukrainians don't seem to have been able to stop this or check it, I believe there is some heavy fighting currently going on in here, including some tank on tank duels and battles. But it sort of tells me that the Ukrainians just either they're not able to deploy their troops from Kiev from the other fronts fast enough, or they just can't risk pulling troops off the line in the Donbass to reinforce this front. So this looks to be an especially stressed part of the Ukrainian position here, and as I've said a couple of times, the biggest headache for them because a lot of these Russian troops being redeployed, you can bet that they are heading towards Izyum. They'll come to back up and reinforce this thrust out here down to the south. And at the moment, the Russians are only really doing one thrust. Russians are building up forces in Donetsk, bringing in hundreds, probably even thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of men to the south whenever the Russians open their offensive from the south to link up with this group out of Izyum. So let's see, what are we actually talking about in distance here? So how do you measure distance on? Okay, measure distance. So from there, and where is this? I was following Novka. Let's say conservatively, let's say about here. What are we talking about in distance? So 89 miles. So yeah, 89 miles. So this is a front of around about just under 100 miles. That's quite a big area, but it's also quite a small area in whenever we're talking about the maneuver warfare that we're talking about, especially whenever you have tens of thousands of men pouring into this area. This It will be a hard slog for the Russians because I can imagine that the Ukrainians are going to fight tooth and nail for everything they've got. But um, if the Russians do achieve a breakout, if they do achieve like so let's just have a look. So from Izyum management. So from Izyum Novkoy. So they're 30 kilometers. The Russians have yeah, 20 miles, 30 roundabout 30 to 40 kilometers the Russians have achieved in ground that they've covered in the space of the past 2 to 3 days. So if the Russians are able to keep up that momentum, which they won't, but just say for argument's sake, if the Russians somehow were able to keep up that momentum from there to the southern portion of this salient, the Russians potentially could achieve that in around about 2 to 3 days. They won't because there's obviously extenuating circumstances in both areas, but it's just to sort of outline, yeah, 89 kilometers sounds like a long distance, and it is a long distance, but in terms of the speed some of these Russian troops are achieving, whenever they do achieve a breakthrough, it is not actually that far. And it sort of says how narrow that the Ukrainian front in this area is and how precarious the Ukrainian position in the Donbass is. So like I say, the Ukrainians will be deploying troops to try and contain this. So you have Ukrainian troops bogged down and fighting all the way along the Donbass. They have to pull in more troops to try and deploy this. Depending how fast Ukraine can redeploy from Kiev, from Chernigov and Sumy, um, Ukrainian troops are probably stretched as it is in this area. And the southern flank of this offensive has not yet begun. So there will be Ukrainian troops here. There have been various battles and skirmishes in this area, but I would imagine because this area hasn't been especially active to the extent of other fronts, some of these Ukrainian troops have probably been pulled off the other areas. So whenever the Russian offensive comes in this area, it could be. Sorry, I think that's an ice cream van outside. Don't know if you guys can hear it. Hopefully not, but nice little segue from talking about the deaths of thousands of men to ice cream vans. But yeah, so once this southern Russian offensive begins into the southern part of the flank, depending on what the Ukrainians are able to muster to try and blunt and hold off that offensive, this Russian offensive could very well just break through all the way along the front, just collapse the entire southern front of the Ukrainian position and advance and link up with these Russian forces to the north. Like I've been trying to emphasize, this would be catastrophic for Ukraine in general, but it would spell, in many ways, I guess it would be a larger, more drawn out Mariupol, but the numbers of Ukrainian troops and equipment that would be captured, destroyed, and eventually surrender in this area would be, it would be very hard for me to see how Ukraine could replace those losses, at least in the extent of time to still be combat effective in this war. The other aspect of what the Russians could be, because it is taking a while, I would have thought the major Russian offensive would have begun by now, but it's taken longer than I expected. One reason for that is there's been various reports coming out of Dnipro for the past week, mostly through that account that I was talking about, that account that appears to be used by Russian military intelligence, that a few days ago, there was a large detachment of Polish foreign volunteers were spotted in Dnipro. They were camping in the local shopping center. I expect that this was them stopping for the night, resting up, re-equipping before they get deployed into the Donbass area. The past couple of days, I've seen lots of reports of significant amounts of Ukrainian troops and vehicles coming into Dnipro, and I guess it's only logical. Like the Ukrainians are aware. Like I know I'm sort of talking about as if I know the ins and outs of the Russians, and the Ukrainians aren't aware this is happening. Yeah, the Ukrainians themselves are aware. Zelensky has said that effectively the war will probably be decided in the Donbass. So the Ukrainians are aware this is where the Russians are going to land their big blow. So they are trying to get in as much troops and as much equipment in the area to try and hold that off. So Dnipro is very critical to this because, as you can see, it is the major logistics route. I guess Zaporozhye as well, but as you can see, this is the roads that come down from Kiev, from Chernigov, from Sumy. Dnipro is the major logistics hub to pass on into the Donbass area. So This is why, if people's been paying attention, the Russians have been striking targets in Dnipro over the past few days, and also in a more general strategic sense. It has been very noticeable that the Russians have for weeks now been hitting Ukrainian oil and fuel depots across the entire country. Ukraine does not produce its own oil. It has to import it. It used to import it from Russia. Used to since 2014, it's largely imported it from other partners, but it does not have its own oil industry. Yeah, it might have a couple of small oil wells here and there, but it is not nearly enough to be self-sustaining. So, why are the fuel depots important? Well, one, you physically destroy the fuel that is there now. That is fuel that is not going to be able to support the local Ukrainian economy. That is not fuel that is going to be able to power the power plants. That is not fuel that is going to be able to sustain the transport and operation of Ukrainian military assets. Also, by destroying the physical tanks the oil is held in, okay, let's say the United States says, okay, we will replace every drop of oil that Russia destroys in Ukraine. Well, if the Russians have destroyed the physics, so if I can just quickly see if I happen to spot the Odessan oil depot just off the top of my head. Yep, here we go. This was bombed quite extensively. It's been hit a number of times since the start of the war, but especially in the past couple days. These tanks are physically destroyed. What do you do with the oil and the fuel? You have to keep them in the trucks. And therefore, you cannot build up a strategic reserve of fuel if you have to keep them in mobile trucks that are also, especially in active combat zones. Fuel trucks are often the first thing that enemy troops and artillery and just in general, a fuel truck is a very healthy target to be one of the first things that you will target and destroy. So the Russians are looking to cripple the ability for Ukraine to fuel its military to a degree. Just by the way the Russians have been able to destroy Ukrainian heavy equipment, the Ukrainians aren't as reliant on fuel, but they still need fuel to just to generally function logistics train. So what do I mean by that statement? Because most Ukrainian tanks and heavy equipment have been destroyed, the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian armed forces has been largely relegated to a more infantry based force. So obviously infantry don't need petrol to run, they just need food. That's okay in places in Kiev, in Chernigov, and Sumy. Whenever these troops were behind the lines, they could move lightly on foot. They could hit targets, Russian targets, and quickly disappear because infantry are a lot harder to hide than a tank. But if you're looking to strategically redeploy all these troops to the Donbass, if you don't physically have the fuel, I expect the Ukrainians probably do have the fuel at this stage to redeploy most of these troops. But a couple weeks down the line, that fuel reserve that Ukraine still happens to have is probably going to run dry. And that's whenever it's really going to start biting. And that is probably whenever the battle in the Donbass will be in full swing. So while these Ukrainian troops are fighting for their lives, they're then going to have to deal with we don't have the fuel to sustain our tanks. We don't have the fuel to bring in more reinforcements. Everything we have to do has to be. If there's anything we want to get into this area, if a person can't walk it in, we can't get it in. That's probably the situation that we could get at some point with the way the Russians are going about the strategic bombing and targeting of Ukrainian fuel reserves. On the flip side, Russia does not have a fuel crisis. Russia has it is so much fuel it doesn't know what to do with it. So I'm not going to in depth on it because I did a dedicated stream specifically on it. If you want to go in and watch that, it's the one that has Belgorod on the name. But there is some conjecture that Ukrainian helicopter strike that hit the fuel refiner, bane of my life. I've lost it again. Here we go. That hit this fuel refinery in Belgorod in Russia. I bizarrely seen the British military intelligence update saying that this would put further stress on the Russian ability to sustain its war. And no, no, it doesn't. Because, yeah, from my understanding, is the Ukrainians were only able to destroy 2 of these tanks. But let's just say if the Ukrainians were able to completely destroy the entire fuel depot, this is a civilian depot. This has no military applications at all. The only thing this caused was a bit of a panic in the local civilian population in Belgorod, who went to the petrol stations the morning this happened and filled up their tanks. But other than that, local fuel prices didn't rise. The fuel deliveries from Russia proper didn't stop. It had no bearing at all on the military situation in Ukraine. Because one, this is not a military target. This is a civilian fuel depot, and also we are talking about Russia. We are talking about this country here. It is the second largest fuel producer in the world. Also, these countries here have just effectively banned the use of Russian fuel. So the Russians have more fuel than what they can deal with. They don't know what to do with it. They have so much fuel, they're willing to sell it at a discount to India to bring in foreign currencies and rupees. So that is the dynamic we have. One side has a complete dominance in fuel. There will never be a shortage of fuel in Russia. If to achieve what Russia is achieving in terms of destroying Ukrainian strategic fuel reserves, like there's no way for Ukraine to significantly dent the ability for Russia to refuel its troops in operations in Ukraine. The only problem with the Russians is once they get across the border, for example, in Kharkov, if you have just for example, let's say you have a Russian military unit here in Nova Volodya, okay, it needs refueled. That fuel has to come in from Belgorod. Okay, it can't go through Kharkov because these roads are contested, so it has to take a long, windy route. Could get ambushed. Fuel's destroyed. Fuel doesn't make it there. That's the logistics problem that Russia has. It just can't. It's had problems getting its fuels and logistics to its troops directly on the field. It has no problem in actually finding the fuel or the equipment in Russia proper to bring to the battlefront. It's just getting it to the frontline troops in the battle zone. That's the problem that Russia has in Ukraine. As I say, the problem the Ukrainians have is just once all this NATO equipment starts arriving in Lvov and in Western Ukraine, once this fuel crisis really starts to bite, yeah, Western governments will probably supply fuel, but okay, you fill up a truck, you take it as far as Kiev, probably needs refueled from there. Okay, then what do you do then? Okay, you fill up that truck again, you send it on down to Dnipro. Well, where's that fuel coming from? Because the strategic fuel reserves, the depots have been destroyed. Has to be filled up from basically fuel trucks or petrol stations that have to be refilled from those fuel trucks. And to sustain that fuel logistics train is you're going to have fuel like a train of fuel trucks coming all the way up from the Romanian and western borders. Because the other thing to understand is it's not just the Ukrainian military that needs this fuel. There are still millions of people in this area that need to be fed. Goods still need to get the market. So this when once it really starts to bite about the shortage of fuel, the hypothesized shortage of fuel in Ukraine, where do you put that fuel? Are you going to send it to? You're going to divert it to the military? How much are you going to divert to the military? How much are you going to divert to continue to supply to fuel the logistics truck that is just going to bring food and essential goods to the local civilian populations in the rest of Ukraine? And then on top of that, I actually don't know off the top of my head, so I should probably have looked at that before I started this spiel. But a lot of Ukrainian electricity is generated by nuclear power, but I would imagine that there are probably some oil and gas fed power plants still operating in Ukraine. Again, if this stretched fuel reserve and fuel supply has to be split between feeding the local population and sustaining the local economy, and then also trying to prop up the military operations, okay, then also does it need to go towards fueling and sustaining some of these power plants? Because once there's brownouts and the power supply starts to get finicky across Ukraine, that's just going to add more problems. So these are the problems and the strategic implications of what Ukraine is facing in terms of the fuel strikes and also this battle in the Donbass. So, um, I'm not mistaken, I think that might be Trying to rack my head. I think that might be the big issues that I was looking to touch. Oh no, there is one other quick thing. If you guys wouldn't mind indulging me, there is a very interesting combat footage emerged today that I would just like to sort of dissect for you guys, sort of give you an idea of how you can parcel out some footage that comes out of Ukraine and what to take away from this stuff. So, pardon me. I'll round out the. Pardon me. I'm not too sure what's going on with me today. So I'll use this to sort of round out the main base of this stream today. So bring this across. So this footage here. So as you can see, this is reported to have been in the past couple of days. Looking at the terrain, I am minded to actually believe that this might actually be in the Izyum area in the Donbass. Or maybe this could have been a withdrawal from Chernigov or Sumy. So I can't directly ascertain where it is, but I have some suspicions of where it might be. But so just to give you an idea, the caption says remarkable footage of a single Ukrainian T-64BV tank engaging a Russian column, destroying a BTR-82A from an ambush position. From other shots, though other shots miss, it appears that it held up the convoy enough for Ukrainian artillery to strike and taken out further Russian assets. So we'll just play this for a bit. I'll just stop it at various points, just sort of annotate what we're looking at, just to give some guys an idea who might not be aware what we can sort of ascertain, what to look out in footage. And also this is very good footage. It's very rare to actually get footage of this clarity and looking at what we're looking at here. So just if you guys wouldn't mind indulging me, we'll just go for this. So as you can see, whoever's put this footage together has very helpfully applied Russian flags above Russian vehicles and the Ukrainian flag above this Ukrainian tank that's down here. So from the start, it is interesting to note why is this Ukrainian tank being able to get so close to this Russian convoy? Very well, this could be Russian troops just moving into the area. This could be the vanguard. However, one thing that has been very noticeable about the Russians is whenever they advance in this fashion. It's vehicle based. They send BTRs, they send tanks, they send BMP2s, and they just drive into a town. I would have thought at least by now the sensible option would have been, so it looks like there is active fighting in this town going by these burning structures. The fact this tank is still here, and also later in the footage there is some interesting stuff that comes out of this building, but I would have thought the logical military doctrine to apply here is you dismount the infantry from these vehicles, you fan them out from the road, you have them sort of check these houses, walk maybe 50, 100 meters away from the road on either side to stop any ambushes from anti-tank infantry, discover enemy tanks like is here, but for whatever reason the Russians don't do this, but they ended up doing it, but it's too late by then. So we'll just play this footage and let you guys have a look, and I'll pop in and out and sort of annotate interesting parts of this footage. So as you can see, this is also the other thing is a lot of these Russian troops are very lucky that the gunner in this tank does not appear to be a very good one, because this is what 25 meters roundabout from this tank to this road. So this gunner couldn't hit this BTR. This looks like a BTR at a range of about 25 to 30 meters. So the people in this BTR are very lucky. Another BTR is not so lucky, but so yeah. The other thing to notice is there is clips in this video. So this is obviously most likely come from a pro-Ukrainian source. So whoever took this footage, we don't know what's happening between these clips. Could it just be nothing of note, potentially? Or could it be something that has also happened, that because this could have been a pro-Ukrainian guy who put this footage together, could we have seen Ukrainian troops being destroyed? Some other crucial context of this battle, we don't know, because he's clipped it. So that is, whenever you see drone footage or footage that is clipped like that, where the frames jip back and forth, that's something to be aware of. Could they intentionally be trying to exclude something from this footage that could add more context to it that would not be more beneficial to my side? So that is something that is also apparent in this footage, is this clipping. So that tank appears to have struck a hit on this BTR. See this tank is smoking. I'll just play it a bit more for you guys to see. So as you can see, just going back, why is that tank smoking? Why is it just clipped to show this? Is this tank deploying its smoke? I don't think it is. I think this tank has taken damage, but what damaged it? I don't think it was that T-64. I think maybe there was some kind of infantry fighting, but this tank has taken damage. They've included this part, which shows that it is damaged, but they don't include what damaged it or what happens to it. So I think that this tank took damage, but it wasn't destroyed, because if it was destroyed, that a destroyed Russian tank is very good for Ukrainian propaganda purposes. So the fact that they actually don't end up showing what happened to this tank would imply to me that this tank probably wasn't completely destroyed. But we'll play it a bit more. So as you can see, that BTR is now fully in flames. So a little bit of time has passed from the footage from whenever the T-64 hit it, and now. So what happened in that period of time? As you can see, there's some kind of something going on in this house. I think this is probably more ammunition potentially cooking off in this house. But as you can see, just another aspect is I've never been in combat myself, so take it with a grain of salt from the armchair general here. But I, from an army family, I've spoken to veterans, and I've known a few people who've been in combat themselves, and just being interested in reviewing footage like this. Combat is chaotic, and especially whenever I've seen footage of Russian vehicle convoys like this being ambushed, they look very chaotic. The Russians don't know where they're being attacked from. This is probably why we've seen so many Russian columns that seem to be randomly abandoned, because of the sheer chaos. Whenever one vehicle explodes, no one knows where the round that destroyed it came from. So do you want to be in another vehicle that could be destroyed, or do you want to get out of the vehicle in decamp and maybe go to the side of the road? It seems that for whatever reason, Russians seem to completely abandon the vehicles and don't come back and retrieve them. But uh, so why am I talking about this? As you can see, these BTRs just seemingly start to randomly fire off in this direction. They do end up starting to go in this direction, but this to me says that the Russians don't know where this tank is, quite surprisingly, considering how close it is. So they are just arbitrarily firing in whatever direction in an attempt to put on covering fire. There, I still think this BTR is not aware of this tank, because I don't think it's firing at this tank. I think it's just arbitrarily firing in this direction, going by those tracers. There you go. It has another shot, but that again, that gunner misses that shot. So these BTRs are lucky that, okay, well, just to stop there. These BTRs are very lucky that this gunner wasn't. It doesn't seem. I don't want to say he's especially good, but he misses that shot. So we'll just go back and play it again. Apologize if this is a bit repetitive for people. I just kind of want to try and emphasize some points in it. As you can see, he seems to be aware of that tank, so he starts firing that direction. There is an infantry there. If you just seen that there is an infantry. So as you can see, I don't know if the footage is going to be good enough quality for it, but this video is in the channel if you guys want to go and watch it in its full quality. But the infantry has now decamped from these BTRs, and they're now fanning out across this area. It's too late for that. One BTR has been destroyed, and I will show some of there has been Russian soldiers killed because of it. So it's a bit late for the infantry to decamp now. They've already incurred losses, but either way, just if it does show up on the video, I apologize to people who might listen to this future in YouTube. I'm aware that YouTube doesn't unfortunately doesn't seem to upload the best quality of the video, so I apologize if some of these small bits of this footage isn't apparent in it. But there is a Russian soldier here and hopefully you'll be able to see him deploy his anti-tank. So there, he fires an anti-tank towards this building. He's aware that this tank is behind it, but the shell is uh, negated by that house. So here, very much, hopefully the footage shows it, all the Russian infantry has disembarked. They're fanning out into, surprisingly, the north part of this village, not the south part where the Ukrainian tank actually is, but... And then this, I believe, is footage of the Ukrainian artillery that starts to come in on the Russian positions that have been held up because of this tank. So it looks like the artillery doesn't quite hit a lot, but I think it destroys another couple of Russian vehicles. But it's not like the entire Russian column was destroyed. But okay, I'm I'm a bit sketchy about showing bodies on YouTube, but I guess it's far enough from it. But this is the BTR that was destroyed by that tank, and as you can see, there is at least one unfortunate Russian soldier. His died beside it, and there is a second here whose body is actually on fire at the moment. So that's quite a grisly scene, and probably very likely, as a BTR is I believe this model of BTR carries around about 6 or 8 soldiers in it. So, worst case scenario, what have you got? You've got the driver, you've got the commander, and you've got the gunner. So you have potentially 9 Russian soldiers could have been killed one incident because, like I say, poor doctrine. They didn't decamp the infantry to scan the surroundings beside the road, and if they had done that, they would obviously have come across that tank. That Ukrainian tank didn't seem to have Ukrainian infantry around it. It was very vulnerable. A single Russian soldier with an RPG who'd come up behind it could easily have destroyed or knocked out that tank. And very well, uh, potentially 9 Russian soldiers here could still be alive as a result of it. So this is another vehicle that appears to have been destroyed from the artillery, but so that's the footage I kind of wanted to go a bit in depth for you guys on. Yes, well, I just meander. I'll just play it through without stopping it for people who are more interested and were kind of irritated for me stopping and starting it. But yeah, so as I say, this kind of footage is very, very rare to have in such clarity to this extent. Another aspect is why it was very pertinent in the first month or so of the war that the Russians weren't deploying their drones for whatever reason. They've since deployed their drones, but another aspect is why wouldn't the Russians potentially have a drone flying ahead of this convoy, searching for things like this Ukrainian tank in potential ambushes? That's another aspect, is the Russians don't seem to make very effective use of their drones. Is it just because they don't have enough drones? I'm skeptical of that because I think Russia, I mean, especially going by their operations in Syria, is Russia seems to have thousands of drones. So for whatever reason, is they just don't seem to be deploying their drones as a active recon in the battlefield to observe advances and spot targets ahead of an advance for whatever reason. But yeah, so for any people, again, if this footage wasn't the best on the screen share, or if it wasn't on the YouTube upload, this footage is in my Telegram channel. Let me just see. If you look up, yeah, basically, if you go into the Telegram channel and you look up Remarkable, because I don't tend to use Remarkable much, just search Remarkable in the search bar, and you will find this footage somewhere there. So, yeah. Uh, with that said, I think that is pretty much everything I was looking to cover in this stream today. So, I hope this has been worth it for you guys. I hope the YouTube video that comes out of this will be worth it for some people to take something from. But other than that, I guess, thank you very much, guys, and I'll speak to you again soon.